Okay, and good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this webinar hosted by the Education Climate Coalition on the boycott of the Science Museum. We've got speakers and involvement from the National Education Union, the London Mining Network, Culture Unstained, and the South Asia Solidarity Group. My name's Daniel Selwyn, and I'm a geography teacher at a secondary school in East London. I'm also the International Solidarity Officer for my National Education Union district. I'm an educator and researcher with the London Mining Network and also a proud member of the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. I'm going to be facilitating the discussion this afternoon and attempting to bring together the insight of our esteemed speakers with the curiosity and wisdom from our wonderful audience. So thank you all for joining us, making the time during a very busy start to term and a crowded calendar of meetings, events, and actions that are currently taking place. Together, we're going to be exploring two fundamental questions that we face as educators, as workers with young people, and as human beings on this beautiful planet we're fortunate enough to call home, which is in the midst of profound, urgent, and overlapping social, ecological, and climate crises. Firstly, while the scientific consensus on the causes of global heating have been long established, we're going to be asking why the foremost scientific and educational institution in the UK continues to accept sponsorship from fossil fuel companies like BP and Adani, and what influence do the companies have on the vitally important educational content that narrates both the origins of this planetary crisis as well as the possible solutions to it. And secondly, we're going to be asking and exploring how we as educators can continue to endorse and promote an institution which many of us have deep feelings of loyalty and care towards, to the young people that we teach, whilst it continues to allow companies like Adani and BP, who have irrefutable records of corruption, ecological crimes, and human rights violations, including most recently in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. How can we allow them and continue to allow them to gain the social license through their sponsorship of the Science Museum? Would we take our students to a museum exhibition on human health funded by Philip Morris International, one of the world's largest tobacco companies? The answer seems as obvious as the question does absurd. Yet fundamentally, what we will humbly seek to demonstrate in this webinar is that the sponsorship of a renewable energy exhibition in the Science Museum by one of the world's largest coal companies should be met with equal scorn and derision, before considering how we can build this campaign and movement to kick polluters and war criminals out of our public institutions. To fulfill this task, I'm delighted to be joined by esteemed colleagues and speakers from various organizations and networks that are involved in this campaign, and I'll be introducing them individually to set out the stall for why this campaign is necessary and important. So firstly, I'm going to hand over to Juliet, who is the co-director at Culture Unstained, a research, engagement and campaigning organization which aims to end fossil fuel sponsorship of culture. Culture Unstained is one of the founding members of the Fossil Free Science Museum Coalition, who are calling for a full educational, cultural and academic boycott of the Science Museum until Adani and BP are dropped as sponsors. Juliet will talk about what BP and Adani gain from their relationships with the Science Museum and why it matters. Thank you, Juliet. Over to you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks to everybody who is here tonight. So when the Royal Shakespeare Company ended their partnership with BP in 2019, they said, amidst the climate emergency, young people are saying clearly to us that the BP sponsorship puts a barrier between them and their wish to engage with the RSC. We cannot ignore that message. Unfortunately, the Science Museum are very good at ignoring that message. Despite the mounting climate crisis, the Science Museum Group has been working in close partnership with 3 oil and gas companies, BP, Shell and Equinor, since the early 2000s. And in 2021, it signed a new sponsorship deal with Indian coal conglomerate Adani. So can you imagine deciding to take your students for a fun day out at the Science Museum, lovely interactive space, and then discovering that that is sponsored by Equinor, a Norwegian oil and gas company drilling in the Arctic, and partnering with Ithaca Energy, which operates in illegal Israeli settlements on Palestinian land? One parent recently said to us, I don't want to take my child to an organization for a fun day out that is funded by the blood of oppressed people. As educators, could you really put your trust in exhibitions on climate science or carbon capture and storage if they were sponsored by Shell? Or on energy transition if it was sponsored by a coal producer, Adani? In the words of a cognitive science professor at Bristol University, you cannot buy honest science with dishonest money. And as educators, would you use educational materials from the Science Museum STEM Academy if they had BP's logo on them, trying to teach your students about climate science? I think Helen, who's one of our speakers tonight, really speaks for a lot of us. She's from the National Education Union. She says, how can any teacher feel comfortable engaging in any educational activity sponsored by BP while it is ramping up its fossil fuel extraction? I'm going to just start by briefly looking at a bit more about why companies like BP and Adani are problematic and how they're linked to the Science Museum. As educators, you're all obviously well aware that both the scientific consensus and the political consensus, as set through the Paris Agreement in 2015, is that we must limit global warming to under 2 degrees Celsius as close to 1.5 as possible. 80% of the fossil fuels that we know about have to stay in the ground. That is not what BP's business plan is forecasting. BP, one of the world's largest oil companies, it produces 3.6 million barrels of oil a day, and since it was founded in 1908, is responsible for nearly 3% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally. It's amazing. It also has an absolutely abysmal track record on environmental harm and human rights abuses. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the biggest oil spill in the history of the oil industry. It killed 11 oil rig workers and spilled 800 million litres of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. They profited from the war in Iraq and even now are being sued over the health impacts of their gas flaring there. And since the start of the war in Gaza, BP is one of several companies who've been granted offshore gas exploration licenses by Israel. And it's the majority shareholder in a pipeline which transports fuel to Israel's military too. They've also spent decades, and I should say millions, lobbying both against climate regulations and shoveling funding towards climate denial organisations. That really shouldn't surprise us because although in 2020 BP said it wanted to become net zero by 2050, earlier this year it did a massive U-turn. It is increasing its investments in oil and gas by about 20% a year and decreasing its renewables funding by more than $5 billion. In other words, so we can all be clear, BP has abandoned its already weak climate goals and it is choosing to plough billions into new extraction. We know that that is contrary to the science. But at the Science Museum, BP sponsors the STEM Academy. Its logo is prominent on the web pages, on the materials, and those are seen and used by educators, museum practitioners, STEM professionals, and young people. BP has been involved in this project right from the start. It partnered with the Science Museum in King's College London at the beginning as a research project. And even then, it was not a hands-off funder. It was very much involved in controlling the governance of the project and doing all of the external comms and public relations, giving it lobbying opportunities with the Department for Education, for example. This really matters for those of us who care about reputable science education because since the Academy formally launched in 2018, it's delivered over 500 courses to over 1.2 million people. That is 1.2 million people being offered bad science. I'm not going to speak a lot about the other sponsor, Adani, because we've got some other speakers tonight who are going to go into them on detail, but they are the world's biggest private producer of coal. They have an extraction model which largely relies on denying the rights of indigenous people to their lands, which is well documented from Australia to India and many other countries. And they're also partnered with arms firm Elbit Systems, which exports Hermes 900 drones to Israel. They're implicated in an absolutely huge array of human rights abuses, bribery, corruption, land grabs, destruction. The important thing to know here is the Science Museum knows all of this. When they chose Adani as their sponsor, they had to do a due diligence process. They covered all of these issues in detail, and they still chose to make Adani sponsor of their climate and energy gallery. A tiny piece of good news, the museum's relationships with Shell and Equinor have ended. I think a question people often want to know is why are these companies interested in sponsoring the Science Museum and other cultural institutions in the first place? I suppose if you are doing a business whose core activity is to cause immense harm, you need to find a way to buy yourself legitimacy from the public, from investors, from decision makers, so you can keep on doing that harm. Sponsorship, in particular cultural sponsorship, has become a really popular strategy to do that. It buys you a social license to operate. In America, for example, BP's comms team were explicitly told that they should leverage their reputation as a champion of STEM education to mitigate potentially harmful impact of policy and political developments. BP is very clearly using sponsorship to reach decision makers and to influence political and cultural figures to be its influencers, its supporters, its defenders. Those are BP's own words. That's not us imagining what they do. That is from their own memos that we have disclosed. I would say that the Science Museum director, Ian Blatchford, is kind of one of the most prominent people who's been only too happy to step up to be an influencer and a supporter and a defender of BP. When BP did that terrible U-turn earlier this year on renewables, the only positive press it got was from its sponsored museums, who all stepped up to call BP vital. And very similarly, when Adani was in the midst of a massive bribery and fraud scandal, the Science Museum was there defending it, helping arrange positive media coverage about it and about the Science Museum sponsorship across a range of press, including Indian press. And I think it's also important to note how far-reaching those sponsorship benefits can be politically. So we know that the Science Museum has helped coordinate meetings hosted at the Science Museum between the billionaire chair of Adani and then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, right at the time of this bribery scheme. So it's very clear, I think, what Adani and BP are getting. But why is the Science Museum allowing itself to be hijacked in this way? I guess the most obvious answer is money. But the Adani sponsorship accounts for less than 0.5% of the museum's annual income, and BP even less. It is not critical to the museum. So where does that leave us? We know that museum goers and a lot of the museum staff really disagree with the Science Museum's current stance on fossil fuel sponsorship. Dr. Hannah Fry and Dr. Joe Foster are both trustees who resigned in protest, as did climate scientist Chris Rapley in 2021. Even the UK's former chief scientific advisor, Sir David King, specifically told the museum that if they wanted to take on sponsors, they must make a commitment to no further investment in oil discovery and no further investment in oil and gas infrastructure. Science Museum has ignored that. Despite the changing context in the sector, there's very much been a move in the last decade to recognising that. So there is a new code of ethics being voted on next month. The Museums Association specifically urges its members to transition away from fossil fuels. That's a really big step, naming fossil fuels as a source of harm. We've also seen other institutions ending their sponsorship relationships with BP and Shell in the last decade. That includes Tate, Edinburgh International Festival, Royal Shakespeare Company, Royal Opera House, National Galleries Scotland, Scottish Ballet, National Theatre, South Bank Centre, the National Gallery, the British Film Institute, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. That's a great list, and I think we can really take heart that the Science Museum is an outlier. It is no longer normal to accept money that fuels climate change and genocide. By continuing to do so, the Science Museum's reputation is at risk because sponsorship, it's always a transaction. It is not a donation. And that's why we are calling for this full educational, cultural and academic boycott until Adani and BP are dropped as sponsors.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was a fantastic overview of why this campaign is so necessary. And I really appreciated you outlining how these companies as businesses plans are fundamentally incompatible with a safe and sustainable future for our planet, how they are continuing to fund climate denial and doubling down on fossil fuel extraction, and particularly your quote around that we cannot buy honest science with dishonest money, and this extent that they're not actually buying honest science. What they're buying is legitimacy and a social license, despite the popular discomfort and disgust from trustees, boards, scientists, educators, and visitors to the museum. So thank you so much for outlining that very succinctly. As you began to mention, Adani is the world's largest private coal producer. And while global temperatures and ice caps melt, sea levels rise, species go extinct, Adani is also massively ramping up its fossil fuel extraction. But despite this, the Science Museum continues to showcase the Adani Solar Park, even while 5 senior Adani Green employees are under indictment in the US for bribery. But to understand more what the word Adani truly means to the communities on the ground to experience the realities of this mega corporation, rather than the sanitized, glossy PR and exhibitions that they produce in the Science Museum, we're really grateful to be joined by Keval from the South Asia Solidarity Group. Kaval is a political economist and activist who spent 15 years on the London Stock Exchange developing corporate strategy and designing financial markets. Since 2010, he has supported numerous social movements, NGOs, and political parties, and he is a member of the South Asia Solidarity Group, an anti-imperialist, anti-racist organization that's based in Britain, supporting and building solidarity with people's struggles for justice and democracy in South Asia, opposing fascism, exploitation, gender and class oppression, imperialism, and war. So can I please big virtual welcome to Kaval to talk us and tell us more about Adani and how they're experienced by communities on the ground.
Thank you. India's economy is a huge success story. That's the official line, at least. It has enormous industrial output and brand new high-tech business parks across the subcontinent, occupied by the world's biggest companies, biggest banks, and entrepreneurs. India is now, in sheer size, the third largest economy in the world, only behind giants China and the US. It has one of the highest numbers of billionaires to be found anywhere in the world. The Indian dream is complete then, achieved through industrial development, technological advancement, private sector efficiency, and banking and finance reform, from slumdog to millionaire, rising school attendance, and a glut of graduates. But deep in India's forested and rural interior, millions of tribal people once lived. Now they are seeking out menial work in cramped and polluted towns and cities after being pushed off their lands and ways of living. Land now appropriated for mining, timber, or development. But I want to focus on their children for a moment, who, with no alternative, get rounded up and shipped off to boarding schools. These factory schools are similar to those set up by colonizers in North America and Australia centuries ago, where mass graves were uncovered. India is currently home to the world's largest factory school. It was Adani funding that made it possible. It accommodates 30,000 children with a capacity for 80,000. Adani publicly states that the goal is to stop tribal people from being a drain on government resources and assimilate them into the private sector economy. Taking children from their lands also makes it easier to seize them. These children are losing their mother tongues, cultures, beliefs, and belonging through erasure and embarrassment, and are being indoctrinated into a single dominant culture centered around consumption and nationalism. We are witnessing a new stolen generation. India's real story is this. For every billionaire, millions are living one meal away from hunger. For every high-tech business park, millions do not have access to an indoor toilet. When measuring India for social progress, equality, decent wages, human development, corruption, or press freedom, India ranks close to the bottom in all of them. Internationally, Adani's senior staff have arrest warrants issued for them. They falsify documents, bribe, commit fraud and financial misconduct, inflate returns, avoid taxes, insider trade, deceive, and even hire spies to surveil climate activists at their homes. Yet no financial authority or court has seriously reprimanded Adani or changed the group's dominant position or political interference. The group's owner is Gautam Adani. He is the 28th wealthiest person in the world, with a personal fortune of nearly £50 billion. His extraordinary wealth could not have started to grow without Modi handing over enormous parts of India's economy to run for a pittance. Who is Narendra Modi, Adani's ally? Modi is a lifelong member of India's violent organization, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS. The RSS believes in the racial purity of Hindus as the only legitimate citizens of India. The RSS grew inspiration from the Black Shirts, the 1920s Italian armed fascists led by Benito Mussolini. It was a former RSS member who assassinated secularist Mahatma Gandhi. Modi wants to follow through by replacing India's secular constitution with a Hindu extremist one that embeds caste and patriarchy over today's equality laws. A move Adani would welcome, as it would pave the way for further exploitation and oppression that's necessary for corporate growth and profits. Through Adani weapons, India is now the world leader in war. India's total military spending is the 5th highest in the world. Despite a UN arms embargo, Adani sells military drones used in Gaza to Israel. Adani and Israel's Elbit Systems have a joint manufacturing plant in India for weapons. Adani is the majority owner of Israel's largest port. India has become the biggest buyer of Israeli arms, accounting for some 37% of Israeli weapons exports. Many of these weapons are violently deployed in Kashmir to seize control of what was autonomous region up to 2019. The BJP, Modi's political party, receives virtually unlimited funding from Adani. His political funding helps the BJP to dominate in elections, the media, and cultural institutions right down into the remotest of villages. Modi does favors for Adani by ensuring broader parts of the Indian state work to further their mutual interests. The Indian judicial system routinely issues anti-democratic judgments. Just yesterday, India's Supreme Court ordered the removal of vast amounts of internet content by people who are exposing Adani. The police, with JCB bulldozers, routinely commit atrocities against tribal communities and minorities. They, along with independent journalists, have been murdered, beaten, and raped for defending lands and livelihoods from Adani's seizure. Modi's far-right policies have, in all, turned India into a hostile place for Muslims, women, low caste and tribal communities, whilst ramping up Hindu nationalism, militarism, and private sector involvement driven by Adani. Large corporations can never be innocent philanthropists and will always be at odds with the fight against global warming and equality. That's why we're boycotting the Science Museum. Please stay in touch with us at South Asia Solidarity Group. Thank you.
So much, Kaval, and that's a really chilling account of the violations, the dispossession, and I can't think of another word to describe it, but genocidal practices of Adani against tribal communities in India. I'm sure all of us here in this webinar today, hello, recognize that the Science Museum's primary focus is, of course, and should be science, education, inspiring the young people in our duty of care as educators. And it's remarkable that it allows companies like Adani to launder their reputation through the institution. And as we've just heard, it's not just the fossil fuel extraction and combustion that's contributing to the climate and ecological crisis. It's also Adani's role in the military industrial complex and ongoing genocide in Gaza that is so devastating in terms of its sponsorship. And this is the company for whom the Science Museum on Monday evening hosted cocktails and canapes in the building itself. So as educators, many of us are fully aware of how our young people have become virtual witnesses to daily live streamed atrocities from Gaza, which is arguably a really significant new safeguarding risk we're confronting in our workplaces, alongside the acute eco-anxiety that younger, as well as not so young generations are experiencing as the climate and ecological crises intensify. So it's vitally important that we situate this campaign to boycott the Science Museum in the context of our educational workplaces, in the curriculum, in the pedagogy, and in education as a site of struggle. To help us to do this, we're immensely grateful to be joined by Meryl from the Ministry of Eco-Education to speak more about what schools can be doing, what they are doing, and why. Thank you, Meryl.
Hello. So at the Ministry of Eco-Education, we provide a framework to support climate, nature and sustainability education in schools. And actually seeing Kaval's child there was just, that's exactly it. We're looking after the younger generation, trying to show them the way. I was a classroom teacher till last summer. I grew up in London, though, in the 1970s, was exposed to that anti-knock leaded petrol, and I loved our school and family visits to the Science Museum. Technology would help us reduce our harmful impact on Earth, I was taught. And so it goes without saying, I'm horrified to find such an insidious company such as Adani is sponsoring the museum. It's not acceptable. And so in 2022, I joined a call of more than 400 teachers to boycott the Science Museum over the Adani sponsorship, and signed an open letter. It's in The Guardian, which is quite amazing. So The Guardian covered this, and I said, through environmental education, young people are becoming increasingly aware of the damage caused by the fossil fuel industry. As a teacher, I try to lead by example and live my life as sustainably as possible. The Science Museum is hugely influential, so it'd be an incredible step in the right direction if they became a leader in promoting decarbonisation and turned their backs on Adani and their ilk. 3 years later on, I can hardly believe that they're still doing it. And as Juliet suggested, it's not even that vast a quantity of money. So why? Why are they doing this? Climate change already kills a comparable number of people to smoking through extreme weather events, with deaths will rise as emissions continue. And India being central to that, they'll really struggle with those 50-degree temperatures that are almost unsurvivable for the elderly and for young people. Fossil fuel sponsorship obfuscates environmental harm through greenwashing. This is something young people really should appreciate. So recently I worked on a video for Chris Packham's petition to ban fossil fuel advertising and sponsorship. And I contacted Chris's team and said, did you know they're really doing this in schools as well as in places like the Science Museum? And so we did a nice little video. I'll put the link into the chat in a moment if you want to catch it up. But it did actually help that petition get over the 100,000 mark, and it was discussed in Parliament. France has already banned fossil fuel advertising and sponsorship. The Hague has banned fossil fuel ads in public spaces. 15 out of 149 universities have pledged fossil fuel divestment. Everybody is getting on this bus, except for the Science Museum. As we heard from Juliet, this petropedagogy is gaining momentum. Fossil fuel companies counter that and with increased school targeting through programs like Equinor's Wonderverse and BP's Classroom Resources, Energising Futures. Meanwhile, they're reducing their investments in renewables, and they always focus on this individual action, and it's all our fault. If we're doing it, it's our fault. No, these are the big companies causing the problems, and the young people should really know that and know how to spot this greenwashing. So schools have this responsibility to educate impartially and towards safeguarding. We need to look after our young people. But we need to make sure that they're aware and can identify misinformation and disinformation. The fact that Adani sponsors the green energy wing is just, they need to have those debates in school. The Science Museum relies on schools and school trips, yet visiting the museum really condones the sponsorship by fossil fuel industry and highly polluting industries. For schools that are in London that take regular trips to the museum, explain why where the museum's getting their funding from, and maybe give the students the choice. There are some great resources on the Education Climate Coalition website that you can do use for an assembly. You could hold a debate. Adani paid £4 million to sponsor that green energy wing. Is greenwashing acceptable? And have a student debate. And even primary students would get that idea that, climate change is happening and it's being caused by the fossil fuel industry. Then you can think about different alternatives to the visits to the Science Museum. I know it's really sad. I loved it as a child. It was really magical, all those hands-on exciting things. But it's if you go, you're saying it's fine, and it's not. So it's difficult because actually, if you look at a lot of the institutions around London that you can go to, for example, the Natural History Museum, the main hall is named after Michael Hintz, who is a billionaire hedge funder and a climate denier in his own rights, and it also has links to Rio Tinto. But the mining industry is slightly different to the fossil fuel industry in some ways, because we're we consume a lot of resources, and we're talking about this transition to green energy. We need the rare earth metals, the copper and the lithium to support that. So companies like Rio Tinto sponsoring the Natural History Museum. It's a difficult one, and you can have those discussions. Life is not simple. You know, really good philosophy for children questions in there. And trying to be squeaky clean is a challenge. I wouldn't necessarily want to say that any museums and things have a back history that's totally clear of slave trade and all, you know, all the rest of the money that's been created on the backs of people and planet. But, you know, and even the Wellcome collection, which is a really exciting museum to go to, might not have fossil fuel links, but it's obviously got links to big pharma. You know, so there's question here is, you know, how quickly can we encourage big organizations to make this green transition with us, to support, you know, the global citizens in our mission to have a planet for the future for our young people. But other suggestions that you could try and look into that probably are not quite so bad, although, as I say, there's, you know, historically the UK has got slightly dirty background in terms of all sorts of ways we've made money. The Royal Observatory in Greenwich, the Horniman Museum in Forest Hill, Grant Museum of Zoology in UCL, the Science Gallery in London. Local university departments can do a really great visits for schools, and most of those universities are now decoupling themselves from fossil fuels. Kew Gardens, the World Wetlands, the London Wetlands Centre, London Zoo, Whitney Zoo. You know, there's all sorts of questions you could have there about, you know, can we support zoos in terms of, you know, animal rights and things. But, you know, conservation is important, and places like Mudshoot Farm to get kids outside in nature. Organise a boycott. Using the materials, using those assembly materials, talk to your head teacher, talk to the kids. If the head teacher's not listening, talk to the kids, discuss it with the eco committee, involve climate active parents, and as Jenny's just said, Wildlife Trust reserves and RSPB probably better than you know. And as I say, it's really sad. Let's hope this Science Museum actually listened, but it's been a long 3 years and they're not listening yet. So a boycott is actually probably the only way forward right now. Thank you. That was me.
Thank you so much, Meryl, and I really appreciated you grounding your contribution in the love that so many of us have for the Science Museum, the magical experiences that we've had there, both as students ourselves and as educators, that this campaign to boycott the Science Museum is coming from a place of how much we actually care about the institution, and that it's allowing itself to be sullied by its relationships with these companies.
And we've got to remember, you know, we kind of sorted out the ozone layer. We kind of sorted out that leaded petrol. We can try and address a lot of the issues to do with the climate crisis and heavily polluting industries, but it's going to take a monumental effort. And boycotting the Science Museum is a quick win.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you very accurately outlined for us, the Science Museum is swimming against the tide of history. Cultural institutions across the board are taking or getting rid of their sponsorship by fossil fuel companies, and they're not allowing, I love the phrase petropedagogy as well, which is placing profit over people and planet, and how we can use philosophy for children and also the alternatives that you outlined as stopgaps until the sponsorships by BP and Adani of the Science Museum end. And I appreciated the provocation around the kind of slippery slope arguments. Where do we draw the line on corporate sponsorship? I think is an interesting question and might be something that we return to as well in the kind of Q&A. But for our final contribution, I'd like to introduce Helen in the National Education Union to talk more about our role as educators, as trade unionists, our schools as workplaces in the campaign to boycott the Science Museum. Helen is a modern foreign languages teacher and English as a foreign language teacher in Cumbria, is an NEU workplace rep and international solidarity officer, and chair of the Cumbria Green Party, where she's also a councillor. So thank you very much, Helen, for joining us. Please can you let us know a little bit more about how we as educators, trade unionists, people who care about young people and science can get involved in this campaign.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. And I'll just say, first of all, apologies for the distractions of my cat. I'm in the kitchen and she thinks that if you're in the kitchen, you're giving her food. So she's been slightly annoying. Others have outlined why it's important to boycott Adani and BP, and what Keval was saying about the situation in India. truly shocked me. I knew some of it, but not all of it. So thank you, Kaval. And yes, we, as educators, we cannot, on the one hand, try and teach our children, whether we're primary, secondary, further education, we cannot teach them about the situation in the world with climate change, the climate crisis, while at the same time taking them to places like the Science Museum that actively takes sponsorship from these companies. The government has introduced sustainability leads in all schools, which is fantastic. But at the same time, we have got big companies that are doing the fueling the climate crisis, human rights abuses. Others have outlined the conflict in Gaza. How can we justify the one without the other? And as trade unionists, we have solidarity with workers and activists around the world. And the children in our care, the children in the global north, are not more important than children of the global majority. And that is what we are being expected to do by going to the Science Museum, implicitly is supporting the Adani and others. We can't justify it. I don't feel critical thinking skills are not taught widely in schools. We have such a crammed curriculum. Something has to give, and it is that. As somebody else, I think it was Meryl said, children are accepting the greenwashing of these things. Like the Science Museum is fantastic, and the Green Energy Wing. So that's all good. But who is funding it? We are not putting in the critical thinking skills that are necessary for our young people to see through all the greenwashing. And in terms of what we as trade union activists can do, the NEU, which is the biggest education union in the country, we have 500,000 members. The motion was passed in conference earlier this year that the NEU would support the Science Museum boycott. So if a teacher feels that they're on their own, you're not on your own. You've got 500,000 people behind you, supporting you. We have your back. So don't feel that you can't do these things. We have your back. There are resources available on the Education Climate Coalition website. There are assemblies for primary and secondary. There's a template letter that schools can use for the boycott. So do explore that website, and please give us your support. So thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Really appreciate your contributions in, again, grounding. For me, one of the most important things about being a trade unionist is the internationalism of it, and whether a child is born in London or in Lagos, in Cumbria or Caracas, Glasgow or Gaza, Manchester, Manila, Doncaster or Delhi, every child has the right to a life and an educational experience of liberation, of play, of joy that comes with learning. So I really appreciated that contribution as a way to kind of motivate all of us to take part in this campaign, and also signposting to people the templates and resources that are available, as well as the fact that we have a democratically voted on conference motion to back up and support members of the National Education Union in speaking up and acting in accordance with the call to boycott the Science Museum. That's an incredibly important and I think empowering weapon that we have in our arsenal as part of this campaign. So I think we've heard from all of our contributors now, and we're now going to kind of move towards a question and answer section. Helen's cat comes and joins us as well for this part, which is wonderful. I wonder what the question might be. Please, as Kate mentioned earlier, feel free to post a question into the chat, and I'm happy to kind of read them out and direct them to any of our speakers who might be in a best place to answer them. I'm happy to kind of kick off proceedings in terms of our Q&A questions, which was kind of building on some of the provocation that that Meryl was making around where we draw the line on corporate sponsorship, and where and how we expect our cultural institutions to get funding from if we are calling for a boycott, which we are, of corporate sponsorships by companies like Adani and BP. So I wondered if anyone wanted to come in on that specific point to begin with. Where do we expect and where are we calling for cultural institutions to be funded from if we're expecting them to divest from the funding that they receive from companies like Adani and BP? Is there anyone who'd like to initially respond to that, Juliet?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So I think, as mentioned, it's really important to remember how little money they're actually getting from these companies. Like, it is not vital to them. And we also saw, I read you out that huge list of institutions in the UK. There's obviously others globally who have ended their fossil fuel deals. None of them have gone under, hey? They're all still alive and well. I think that's really important. And there is a flip side of it, which is if you have a relationship with a fossil fuel company who isn't willing to have a relationship with you, if you sever your relationship with a fossil fuel company, you are opening up other potential relationships, other potential sponsors. We saw that, for example, recently with the Edinburgh International Book Festival. There was a big campaign and a big controversy around their funder, Baillie Gifford. When the book festival decided to end that relationship with Baillie Gifford, which they did in a very unhappy and not very good way. It was the authors involved in that campaign themselves who went and found another source of funding. They got £100,000 from Bloomsbury. I do think, however, it's also worth saying that very often that question is asked to try and make you feel like because you don't have the answer, you're not allowed to be critical. And that is not true. It is not our job to find funders for those museums. It is their job. They have people who are paid far more than any of us are precisely to do that. And I think what I would say is that at Culture on Stain, for example, we don't name good sponsors, but we do talk about process. These institutions need to have better processes. They need to have transparency. They need to have relationships with their stakeholders. They need to have due diligence. They need to have ongoing engagement. Why are these organizations not asking themselves, what are we being asked to do? What are these companies gaining from it? How will it implicate us? How does it affect our constituents? And that is really what we want. There are red lines out there, and for me, fossil fuels is one of them. But I think institutions have to understand that it is their choice to draw up those red lines and to navigate them.
Thank you, Julia. Really comprehensive. Val, did you have a contribution to make that question as well?
Yeah, I do actually, and I was going to include this in my talk, but I think I ran out of time. Because of the nature of my work, I tend to have a lot of similar debates in other sectors. So, say for example, if I'm going up against a CEO or a head of a bank about why they should pay more tax or why billionaires should pay more tax, and if they pay more tax, then they'll just end up leaving the UK. And how will our economy continue to grow? And there's actually similar ideas that you could get from things like the campaign for a wealth tax, or how you can get a windfall tax on banks' profits. It's economically illiterate to assume that an organization like the Science Museum or any organization that has a key public duty can go under. It just simply can't. And the reason why that's the case is because if you remember what happened during the financial crash, the government created and has since the financial crash created £1 trillion out of thin air to give to the financial sector. right? And these companies were ranging from companies that had mortgages or bank accounts. We know that there is when the government wants to do capital raising, it is perfectly entitled to. You may recall Theresa May talking about there is no magic money tree. It's actually, she's wrong. There is. It's called quantitative easing. The Bank of England can get works for the government in effect and can give the government the money that it needs, which brings like back to the point that funding for these sorts of institutions is a political issue, right? We mustn't forget that what's happened with privatization over the last 20, 30 years is that there's always been a round of underfunding to manufacture consent for private sector involvement. And that's what's happening now with the NHS, and it's happening in the education sector, right? The NHS and the private sector is gunning for the NHS, and the private sector is gunning for the education sector. The way that the government makes that happen, not to sound cynical, is to deliberately underfund it and to come up with false illiterate economic arguments that there is no magic money tree. If we want to go to war tomorrow, the government will raise £1 trillion, right? It's a political choice. So I think in addition to what Juliet was saying about, it's not our job to do that, I just wanted to throw in a few, like 2 pence from an economic perspective, which is that actually the people who ask that question are should be told, well, how come there's money for war?
I think that was more than 2 pence worth, but I really appreciate that contribution. I think, again, a great argument to be able to make that there is always seems to be money for infrastructures that are killing and destroying the planet, whether that be subsidies to the fossil fuel industry or whether that be the military industrial complex, but the infrastructures of care that we all want and believe in, whether that's the health system, the education system, or our cultural institutions, are being systematically underfunded. And that's the kind of crucial structural context in which this boycott campaign is kind of situated within. So thank you very much for that, Val. We'll still keeping an eye on the chat to see if there are any questions from anyone in the audience. I'm also happy to throw another kind of question out there to any of our panelists. That not all of us in this call, in this webinar today, are going to be educators. There might be parents and carers. There might be also different education workers, from kitchen and cleaning staff, support and pastoral staff, up to kind of senior leaders in schools, community groups, and even and especially the young people. So I kind of wanted to ask people if they had any thoughts or suggestions for how this kind of broad array of different stakeholders can get involved in this campaign to boycott the Science Museum. Meryl?
Whenever I have a problem, I do 2 things. First is to look at the Sustainable Development Goals and think, well, what's the bigger picture? How does this all relate? Let's put that to one side. The second is always youth voice. It's about getting young people to speak up and support them to do so, encourage those oracy skills. I know the government's actually looking at oracy voice 21 to try and promote oracy. Youth voice. I am blown away by the thought that just that creative thinking that, given the opportunity, young people can come up with solutions, criticisms. They can put people on the spot. Can we get a debate with a young, youth council and the spot, the people from the Science Museum, so that they can be put on the spot by young people whose lives are going to be seriously affected by companies such as Adani? That would be my, youth voice is a huge opportunity to try and push change, not by using young people, but by enabling them to be able to use their voice to call for change. And so for me, that would be, I think a step in the right direction. How it would work, don't know, but I'm sure we could facilitate it if the Science Museum leaders were willing to come to the table.
Wonderful. Thank you, Meryl. I think we can all get behind enabling and empowering our young people on this call to be they're part of this campaign and to be leading really on these incredibly critical and important issues. And thank you to Juliet, who's posted into the chat the kind of actions that specifically parents, educators, and cultural workers more broadly can take. So please do take a note of those links that have been posted. Did anyone else want to contribute on that question specifically? Otherwise, it might be worth asking for Helen.
Daniel, I think Eleanor's going to speak.
Oh, sorry, I
to
can't
interrupt you, Daniel.
Let's see. Brett.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, Eleanor. Hello.
Hi. Just quickly, I'm a parent, and I just wanted to say that I did bring up the topic when my daughter's she was in year 7, and at the end of last year, I discovered that her school were taking year 7 and, well, I didn't realize straight away, but turned out also year 9 to the Science Museum. I first of all brought it up, but a little bit late amongst a parents group, which about 3 or 4 people came forward in support, but really it was extremely quiet, all a bit embarrassing. And then I did approach the head teacher and a few other teachers as well, and the head teacher didn't like it. I was definitely being treated like a troublemaker. And, you know, I don't want to clash with the head teacher right at the beginning. So it felt all a bit boring and frustrating. But I was actually really consoled when I discovered that actually the year 9s were thinking about it. And it was actually, so I think amongst the teachers, so the head teacher said, please only write to me, because I said, I'm going to ask for a meeting in September, and he said only write to me in September. And so I told him about this meeting, but what I wanted to say was that, yeah, when I heard about the fact that the word was getting out amongst the pupils, and so the slightly older pupils, the year 9s, it was actually becoming, so although the parents in the WhatsApp group were completely silent, almost, I think it was getting talked about at home. And then that translated into friend groups as well. And then I was giving a lift to my daughter and her friend to school, and we hadn't talked about it. Only that I was saying to my daughter, I'm really sorry, I think it might mean that you can't go to the class because to the trip, because the teachers actually hadn't got back to me and said, because I said, I don't know what to do. I'm in a dilemma. I don't know what to do. I'd welcome somebody to speak to me, and they didn't. So I said, oh, well, that means it's now your fault because you've told me she can't go because I've confirmed it too late. And it's not because I have said no, it's because I was saying I'm on the fence. Anyway, so all sort of the topic was raised rather unsatisfactorily. But I actually have hope that even that uncomfortableness has been useful, especially amongst the pupils. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much for putting yourself in that uncomfortable place. It's hard to do, but well done. There are actually some assemblies on the Education Climate Coalition website if they're useful to pass on to teachers for PSHE or even geography or RE or something, or science, if that's helpful. I'll put a link in the chat.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor, for your work, though.
Yeah, thank you so much, and for sharing the perspective as well with all of us. I think, yeah, you've taken the most courageous initial step, which is to speak up rather than to be silent when we see that this is happening. So again, really want to appreciate you for sharing.
Also, I was comforted when the girl that I was giving a lift to said to me, just getting out of the car, she said, I wish my mum didn't let me go to the Science Museum. And I was like, yeah, I didn't say anything to her before, and it was like, that means something. Anyway, I'm going to stop now. All mums boycott the Science Museum. I think that's a nice little badge that could be made, I think, at some point as part of the merch. Yeah, I just really remember that my parents weren't activists at all, and they never will be. But I had a friend whose mum was going to Green and Common or something, and you know, I didn't know much about it, but it was that coolness that I think has carried with me, just the memory of knowing somebody that did it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's every action is a ripple, right? And we don't necessarily know where that's going to end up, but it has a huge impact on the people around us. So again, thanks for sharing that. We have a question in the chat about greenwashing generally, and kind of even how much greenwashing there might be in, and there is, in sustainability and environmental education. So Michelle in the chat has mentioned how Eco Schools has partners from Mars to Toyota to Alcoa Foundation, Bupa Foundation, all of whom have kind of accusations of greenwashing and or support for Israel lodged against them. So it's clear that the problem of sponsorship is an endemic one. The question Michelle asked is, would encouraging children to critically explore sponsorship contributions be one way of helping offset the greenwashing? Anyone feel like coming in on that question?
I'm happy to come in if others are okay with that.
Yes, please, Helen.
I think, sorry, I'm just going to move the chat back up so I can see the question. Yeah, encouraging children to critically explore sponsorship. I think, yes, we need to be empowering our children to ask these questions. And as I said earlier, critical thinking skills is something that has been squeezed out of the curriculum. And political education, political with a small p. So yes, whether this can be done, if it's not done directly through the curriculum, most schools have some form of eco council or green club or climate club. So yes, if people could, parents, encourage your children to ask in their climate groups who about the, you know, as Eleanor did, who's sponsoring these trips, who is there behind it, who is Adani, what do BP do? If we can get children to ask those sorts of questions. So any parents on the call, if you haven't got a green club in your school, get one going. And education staff on the call, likewise, if you haven't got one, get one going.
Great, thank you, Helen. Eco clubs are always fantastic at school, but I think there are loads of spaces, even if it's just form time discussions. We call it kind of coaching at my school, where we have lots of debates. We've got a human rights club. All of these things are linked. There are spaces for young people to discuss these issues. And I think, yeah, greenwashing is such an endemic and pervasive thing. I mean, particularly I find that as a geography educator, we have a responsibility to equip our young people with the critical faculties and skills to identify greenwashing when they see it. So thank you very much for that question. And thank you as well to Juliet, who's signposting in the chat the fantastic work done by student campaigning group People and Planet, who work in colleges and university campuses on these issues around greenwashing, but also particularly on things like careers fairs and disrupting careers fairs and trying to get fossil fuel and arms companies, as well as mining companies now as well, out of those career fairs. So thank you for spotlighting that. One further question, which I think is relevant and important for people that I think would be good to have recorded and on the webinar, is that many people might be engaging and watching this webinar or listening to it very far away from London. Might be up in Cumbria, or might be up in Scotland, Wales, wherever it might be. Why would we say it's still important for schools that might not necessarily be planning trips to the Science Museum due to the distance? Why would we still say it's important for those schools to be involved in the campaign to boycott the Science Museum? Would anyone like to respond to that particular question?
I think Meryl will speak to that. Thank you, Meryl.
Thank you.
Sorry, my raise hands little icon isn't working for everyone.
We've got your actual hand.
No, exactly. I've got hands.
That's better than the virtual one.
So when I boycotted the Science Museum, I had taken one. So I was working in a small middle school in rural Northumberland, literally 300 or 400 miles away from London. I had taken a school trip and we had gone to the Natural History Museum, so we could have gone to the Science Museum. But I decided that I was going to be very vocal about boycotting the Science Museum, despite the fact that I was very unlikely to ever take children to that museum. And even though those hundreds of miles in between me and the Science Museum, it's literally a museum designed for education and to try and attract young people to go into those rooms and use those hands-on activities. And the fact that they are greenwashing is just not acceptable. And I'm so irate that even though I'm not taking my kids down to the Science Museum because it's hundreds of miles away, I think for me to use my voice and in any influence I have to provide support for incredible organisations such as Culture Unstained, who are calling this out. I think as teachers, we have huge amounts of influence in our classrooms, but actually we have huge amounts of influence outside our classrooms. Teaching as a profession, it's huge. There are hundreds of thousands of us across the country. My little voice added to everybody else's little voices can make a difference. And so it didn't matter to me that I was, all the way up here in Northumberland, and relatively pleased I'm not down in London in many ways. It is a national institution, and therefore we should be, using our voice wherever we are.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for clarifying that so eloquently. Juliet, do you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to back up Meryl. Like I said earlier, the Science Museum have a really thick skin. Like we've thrown a lot of stuff at them, which you'd think would kind of damage their reputation beyond repair. And they're still at it. But I think this audience is different. Like they are really proud of their STEM offering, and actually so are BP. And I think if we can get to the situation where they are seeing the number of school visits going down and down and down and not recovering, I actually think that will make a difference in a way that some of the other things haven't done. Like there's a lot of people they are very willing to dismiss, wrongly, in my opinion, but they will find it a lot harder to dismiss educators and scientists. And that's why it's really exciting to have this boycott and to have so many of these amazing groups on board. So yeah, fingers crossed, let's keep at it.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that really highlights the leverage that we have in this campaign, and why it's important, I think, for us to be using the collective leverage that we have as schools to boycott, and not as individuals, even though the individual boycott is important as well. There's also other comments in the chat about how the STEM Academy is available for all schools, irrespective of where they are. So it's important for all schools to sign the boycott, even if they are too far to actually visit. And I think that's a really important point. That's the BP resources and STEM Academy. So there are ways in which the sponsorship of the Science Museum pervades educational institutions and schools and colleges across the country. It doesn't stay within the walls of the Science Museum. So that's another really important contribution to add. I wanted to maybe just give, before kind of my own closing comments and we wrap up the webinar, last opportunities for any contributions from our panelists here today to make a final maybe plea or point around how people can get involved in the campaign, and what maybe some key messages might be for people to take to their head teachers tomorrow, whether they're parents, whether they're teachers, and whether education workers in any respect. What would you want the kind of key final takeaway for people to be from this webinar? Anyone feel like starting on that?
But I just had a quick thought. Even if you think you're too far away from London to visit the Science Museum, it doesn't stop you telling the Science Museum that you're not going to visit them because of their sponsorship by Adani and BP. So it's a win-win. You're not going to go anyway, but they don't need to know that.
Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, just join the boycott. I think, and tell everybody else to join the boycott. There's you know, a ripple that can be sent outwards here. 3 years ago, I thought, oh, yeah, I'm in The Guardian saying about banning fossil fuels and Adani from the Science Museum. And literally nothing really has changed. We need more people, and boycotting the museum, not going, not putting, you know, feet through that door, unless it's to do some sort of action.
Thank you, Meryl.
Could I just say something quickly about the, sorry, Kaval, did I just talk over you? Sorry.
No, I was about to bring him in, but you can go first.
Sorry. Just that there's 2 assemblies on the Education Climate Coalition website. I did put the links in the chat. They're easy to find. They are not they're for teachers to use, oriented around primary age and oriented around secondary age, although they're pretty similar, to be honest. They're just to raise the questions with students in the classroom. They're not like, you should do this, because that's not a place you want to be in, especially if you teach teenagers, because they just won't do it. It's raising questions, exploring the idea of, you know, people power, the power of the consumer. So actually it's a more open conversation for teachers to have with their students and other people to have with other students in their life. So just wanted to plug that before we close. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Kaval.
Thank you, Kate. I think that's, really important for people to know that we don't have to start all these resources from scratch. They've already been made, and that's a result of the legacy of the fantastic work that's gone into this campaign over many years already. So I want to take that opportunity to thank all the people who contributed and worked hard on those resources over the last few years. Kaval, do you want to make any final contribution?
Yeah, perhaps just something that hasn't been talked about and isn't necessarily related to, you know, how we can, you know, really mobilize the boycott, but it's worth mentioning, which is when we tried to talk directly to Sir Ian Blatchford about Adani, his response was, Adani is doing great things with coal for the poorest people in India. And he kind of offered this patronizing view that in order for India's poorest people to escape poverty, they first have to do what the world did 200 years ago, which was to burn coal. And I think he represents sort of what's wrong with the corporate world in general, because he is a former banker, somehow has slithered his way up to run the Science Museum, which is incredible. The Science Museum should be run by people who love science and want to teach children about science. I think Adani and BP sponsorship of the Science Museum is kind of indicative of what's happening at a political level here in the UK as well. The Science Museum is getting away with using fossil fuel sponsors because the government doesn't really care. The British establishment doesn't really care. So I think we have to also recognize that there's a deep-seated problem here with our politics, with the people in charge, with the British establishment. So that's why I think this is really important. But I think it really can go up to other political up the political chain, as it were.
Thank you, Kaval. And Julia?
Yeah, just my closing thought. I wanted to add to that. Ian Blatchford, this former banker, has also said that even if the Science Museum were lavishly public funded, he would still want to take money from oil companies. So that maybe gives you a measure of the kind of person he is. A lot of these wealthy museum directors, so like the head of the British Museum, for example, they like to go around saying, well, it's a choice. We can either take money from these oil companies or we can start charging you to come into our museums. And I want to say, like, that is not the choice. Like, that is a false equivalence. Those are not the choices that are on the table. Arts and culture belong to us, and they are spaces for creativity and for imagination and for making a better world. We know that all of these young people that we've been talking about today are brilliant on these issues, and so are the artists, because art is political. Every single sector needs a just transition, and arts and culture is not an exception. And luckily, there's absolutely amazing people in that sector who can make that happen. So don't let anyone tell you that those are the only choices. We can think bigger and we can do better, and we will win this.
Amazing. Thank you, Julia. So just to close and bring all of that together, thank you so much to all of our panelists and contributors. Thank you to wonderful contributions from all of us in the audience here. I think what we've gained from this webinar is reaffirmed knowledge that schools, that young people, that we are the lifeline and the lifeblood of the Science Museum. We are the social license which they are lending to Adani and BP without our consent. And we've seen many institutions dropping fossil fuel sponsorship, even more now dropping their links to arms companies. Adani pays a fraction of what the Science Museum's overall budget is, and it's a bargain for what they gain in terms of reputation, networking with trustees and sponsors, influencing content, having galleries named after them. But what this campaign that we are all part of has already done is cloud this cozy relationship. We've seen contributors, trustees, advisory board members resign, and due to the embarrassment caused to the spotlight that the organisations you've heard from here this afternoon have put on the Science Museum sponsorship. So as Juliet said, we can win this if we continue to build this campaign. And not only can we win this, we are confident that we will win this, because fossil fuels and arms companies are on the wrong side of not only history, but also our collective futures, and especially the futures of the young people and communities that we serve as educators. So thank you all very much for being part of this webinar this evening. Please do take all of the messages and resources that you've heard this evening into your workplaces, into conversations with stakeholders to make sure that we boycott the Science Museum in order to be able to go back to the Science Museum once they drop their sponsorships of Adani and BP. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Danny. That was superb.
Thank you. Bye.